Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya al-salah. Hayya al-salah. Hayya al-falah. Hayya al-falah. Allahu Akbar. La الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم، ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمد رسول الله. اللهم يا رحمن يا رحيم، اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. سبحان الله سبحان الله، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستنصره ونستجيره، فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. اللهم يا رحمن يا رحيم، يا عزيز يا جبار، اللهم يا رب اصلح لنا ديننا الذي هو عصمة أمرنا، واصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا، واصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا، واجعل الحياة زيادة لنا في كل خير، واجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر، يا رحمن يا رحيم. Of course, the mind and heart and soul is preoccupied by the continuing slaughter in Palestine. We are now approaching an entire month with the full realization that Israel has dumped on this limited space, this limited territory, nowhere the size of Japan, the territory perhaps akin to the territory of Warsaw, during the siege of Warsaw in World War II, perhaps akin to the siege of Stalingrad in World War II. But Israel has unleashed upon this territory the equivalent of 2 Hiroshima bombs. The explosives that Israel has used and the missiles and the bombing of Gaza at this point equals 2 atomic bombs that have been dropped on Hiroshima. An astounding figure, truly an astounding figure. And especially in light of the fact that if you follow Israeli media, you are often flabbergasted by how freely Israeli commentators speculate and fantasize about dropping an actual nuclear weapon on Gaza. So many Israeli commentators don't seem to be at all bothered by the spiraling numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza, the endless sights of bodies wrapped up in sheets, laid on concrete or laid on the floors or laid in courtyards. These images by now fill the airwaves. They're undeniable. Every hospital in Gaza by now has been struck in one form or another by Israel. Every hospital has been forced to work without electricity, with extreme shortages, and the endless sight of bodies wrapped up in sheets, not even real proper body bags, but just white sheets, laid in rows, numerous bodies. And again, it is astounding that so many commentators in Israel do not seem at all disturbed by these extremely tragic and traumatizing sights of civilians torn to shreds and children torn to pieces. But it is not unusual at this point, whether this is a real possibility or not is not the issue. The issue is what is tolerated on open airwaves and what is considered to be an acceptable engagement worthy discourse among Israelis. And so there is quite often the acknowledgement that yes, we did drop the equivalent of 2 Hiroshima bombs on Gaza, but that is not enough. And if Israeli casualties continue to rise, perhaps Israel needs to consider the nuke option, the Samson option, as it is often referred to in Israel. A truly shocking form of discourse, because it is no secret what the demoralizing and dehumanizing implications of saying, well, there is immoral logic to using total weapons and final solution weapons, as the US did in World War II when it dropped atomic bombs on Japan. Perhaps that is the solution to our Palestinian problem. At the same time, that we hear commentators make arguments like this, and we see these commentators being invited time and again to the same TV stations, the same TV programs. In fact, some of these commentators hold doctorates and hold important policy positions or academic positions. And what is effectively an argument for extermination and mass slaughter is tolerated and engaged. It's tolerated and engaged. There are, of course, you hear practical arguments like, well, if we use an atomic weapon or a nuclear weapon in Gaza, Gaza will be rendered uninhabitable. And how long before we can move in? But one of the most shocking things is the absence of humanitarian, moral, ethical, objections to the most basic and fundamental precept. Even if you believe that this land is truly yours, even if you believe, for whatever reasons, that you have a legitimate, morally defensible claim to this land, how on God's earth do you believe that there could possibly be a morally defensible argument for extermination and indiscriminate slaughter? How could there be an ethical argument to bombing ambulances, bombing hospitals, bombing schools, bombing UN buildings that belong to the UNRWA, leave alone the systematic destruction of mosques? Because if it is quite easy for the powerful side to always claim, I am in pursuit of the lawless and I am in pursuit of criminal elements. And if basically the powerful side in this equation knows that there will be no accountability as to whatever claims they make, even if we assume sincerity, human beings are corrupted by power. And by definition, a military that is angry and aggrieved and that is intoxicated with bloodlust and intoxicated with unaccountable power, power that the United States and the rest of the Western world have transferred to Israel, an absolute, unaccountable, irregressible power. The natural tendency in human beings is to make sweeping, careless claims that evade responsibility and moral accountability. But here we are not just talking about indiscriminate bombing. We are talking about an open discourse in which extermination is branded around, is kicked around, as if it is a natural and reasonable option. In the same vein, there is a ministry in Israel that came out called the Ministry of Intelligence, that came out with a fully developed plan for the mass transfer of Palestinians from Gaza to Egypt. And according to this report that was leaked, report prepared by the Ministry of Intelligence in Israel, the Ministry of Intelligence recommends and sets out a fairly detailed plan as to how Israel can use terror, and violence to forcibly displace the entire population of Gaza, over 2 million Gazans, to Egypt. And in this report, the ministry goes into considerable detail about how then Israel should use its influence in the world, of course, through the United States, to compensate Egypt for allowing their Palestinian refugees, over 2 million of them, to be settled in Egypt. The report even goes and talks about how Egypt should be supplied initially with tents to accommodate the millions of Palestinians, and Egypt should be given very clear instructions that these Palestinians are to be settled in certain areas and territories in the Sinai Desert so that they are not too close to the Israeli border. And then Egypt is to be assisted in building permanent structures, like very much the refugee camps that exist in the West Bank or in Jordan or in Lebanon, creating refugee camps in the middle of the desert for the Palestinian population. And of course, as you're reading this report, the thing that clearly presses on you and thing that is on your mind, well, why stop there? If you're going to transfer the population of Gaza to Egypt, and you're going to use world powers to compensate the corrupt government of Egypt, and by the way, the Ministry of Intelligence, the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence, talks about how corrupt the Egyptian dictator is and how corrupt his government is and how their spending and how their corruption has ruined the economy of the country, Egypt's economy, and how vulnerable they are to bribery, and how the West should not be afraid to offer the Egyptian military money, because when all is said and done, the Egyptian military will sell anything for money. You're talking about extermination options. You're talking about a governmental agency that lays out a full plan, not just for the systematic displacement and abuse of the Palestinian people, but for deciding the fate of Israel's neighbors. Because, mind you, in order for a plan like this to work, Israel and its allies would need to ensure that there's a certain type of government in Egypt, the type of government that would accept money, and the type of government that not only is corruptible and is corrupted, not only that, but an immoral and an inhumane type of government that would not be bothered by a second Nakba and would not be bothered by the mass reality of death and suffering and misery that inevitably would accompany the violent, terror-induced transfer. Terror-induced. So terror used by Hamas is terrorism, but terror used by Israel to displace Palestinians again is a policy option that is seriously discussed and analyzed. And in all the discussions, I have not yet seen someone say, but wait, this is immoral. We have been oppressing the Palestinian people for 70 plus years, and it is immoral to solve oppression with more oppression. I haven't heard it. Of course, there are brave Jewish voices that are standing up against this immorality. But I am talking about the public discourse that is tolerated, not just on Israeli TV and Israeli programs, but that are battered around and freely exchanged on Facebook and Twitter and various methods and modes of social media without anyone particularly troubled. All of us know the extent to which social media is sensitized to people supporting terrorism as an option. And all of us know that if you're a Muslim and you even remotely consider or say anything that could possibly be understood as supporting terrorism as an option, but on the other side of things, there is a moral ethical block that we are discussing, or they are discussing, corruption, bribery, dictatorship, transfer of populations, which is genocide under the Genocide Convention, so freely and openly. At the same time, not just the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence, but there is an Institute for Advanced Studies, or institute, think tank, effectively, called Miskab in Israel, that came out with another report also recommending the mass transfer of Palestinians to Egypt, and also going into the same type of details. Egypt is a dictatorship. It doesn't matter if the Egyptian people like it or not. We can deal with the Egyptian military if we can get the Saudis and the Emiratis to commit enough money. Then we can buy the Egyptian military, and the Egyptian military will, if paid enough by Saudi and Emirati money, they will happily allow the forcible transfer of Palestinians, and we would create a buffer zone between the refugee camps created in Egypt for Palestinians and Israel. So there's a no man's land between the two. Meanwhile, as your mind goes to, well, if this is the solution that you consider to be acceptable, today your excuse is Hamas. But as we witness your conduct in the West Bank, anytime as long as the Palestinian Authority is acting precisely like the model corrupt government of Egypt, according to your reports, in other words, as long as the Palestinian Authority is accepting money and living subservient to you, you have no problem. But what happens, as we are witnessing right now, Palestinians get tired of the oppression and rebel against both the Palestinian Authority and against Israeli oppression. Well, the logic of transfer can be extended to the West Bank. If you've opened that type of narrative as a policy choice. Now, this is especially in light of the details of what is going on in the West Bank. Ben Gvir brags about buying weapons and distributing. The last declaration I've seen from Ben Gvir is he's bragging about distributing 1,000 guns to 1,000 settlers. And as the world, the Western world, preoccupies itself with making sure that this Israeli Goliath is safe from the small David that confronts it in Gaza, because it is the Goliath fighting, whether you want to say David or any other figure, but it is a small figure. Israel has one of the most advanced militaries on the face of this earth. Israel has military industries. Israel manufactures its own tanks. It manufactures its own fighter jets. It has one of the most advanced surveillance and intelligence military industries in the world. Israel has full armies. And whatever, even if you exaggerate Hamas's strength to the extreme, you are talking about weaponry that couldn't even resist the Nazi army in World War II or any army from World War II. When you are talking about Hamas, you're talking about rockets and missiles and guns. So as the world concerns itself with the safety of the Goliath and making sure that the Goliath is not somehow terrified by what it can absolutely step on and squish, as these commentators keep reminding us, that Israel can simply nuke them and end the entire thing. Israel has a considerable nuclear arsenal. No one is paying attention to what is happening in Gaza. For instance, no one is paying attention to the systematic attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinian fields and Palestinian homes, that just this last week, 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank were displaced because their village was completely destroyed by Israeli settlers. The Israeli settlers, in fact, are already applying the logic advocated by the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence and by the Miskab think tank. They are already implementing that logic in the West Bank. And they are, with the protection of the Israeli army, regularly, every single night, attacking Palestinian villages, destroying Palestinian homes, and indeed murdering Palestinian unarmed villagers in order to spread terror and fear. And as I mentioned before, distributing leaflets saying, "Leave, the second Nakba is coming." Now, all of this is particularly significant because how the world frequently mishandles a discourse it doesn't understand and entirely ignores a discourse that it could understand. When it comes to Muslims, no sophistication and no discernment is needed. Muslims are branded and stereotyped and caricatured with very little in terms of knowledge base or facts or data. But in the case of Israel, what we allow to pass and go by is truly astounding. When this campaign started, Netanyahu stood before the world and made an announcement that Israel is now going to launch a campaign against the people of darkness. Netanyahu clearly, in this brief statement, posited the Israelis as people of light and the other side as people of darkness. But Netanyahu made a very significant reference when he said, made a reference to the promise of Isaiah and said that Isaiah promised that Israel will be an eternal country, and attempted to connect what Israel was about to unleash against Hamas or against the Gazans, because it's not Hamas. This is a fallacy that Israel is at war with Hamas. Israel is at war with Palestinians, quite simply. But what Netanyahu told the world is that Isaiah promised an eternal state and promised that the borders of the state will be secure, and importantly, that the enemies of this state will be ruined and destroyed. So, as Netanyahu is about to unleash this violence, the part of Isaiah that he is referring to is chapter 60, verse 18. No longer will violence be heard in your land, nor ruin or destruction within your borders. But you will call your walls salvation and your gates praise. Well, that's wonderful, except that what comes before this reference in Isaiah to having a secure and stable and secure borders. And this is what Netanyahu clearly has in mind, is that before that, Isaiah chapter 60 says, verse 14, the children of your oppressors will come bowing before you. All who despise you will bow down at your feet. Now, in commentaries on this passage in Isaiah, part of Isaiah's prophecy is that you will make your borders secure as you subjugate your enemies so that they will come bowing at your feet, i.e., become your servants. Now, this biblical reference, there is no inevitability to the way that Netanyahu reads this biblical reference or interprets this biblical reference. In other words, you can interpret this reference as Isaiah speaking about not the modern state of Israel, but as Isaiah speaking about the state of Israel that existed historically and has expired. Isaiah, as a prophet, existed before the Babylonians destroyed the Second Temple and led the Jewish people into slavery. So Isaiah, or the prophecies of Isaiah, could be simply describing a historical past with no relevance to the current moment we're in. But the fact that Netanyahu made a reference to Isaiah's promise and interpreted Isaiah normatively, Isaiah promised us a state and promised us a state that will be eternal and promised us a state that will have secure borders and promised us a state that will have secure borders by subjugating its enemies and bringing them bowing before our feet. That's dangerous logic. I want you to imagine if a Muslim would have made this type of reference. I want you to imagine the reaction of the entire world as saying, so you are not interested in giving these people their rights. You're just interested in subjugating them. Oh, so it's clear you weren't interested ever in peace. You were always interested in vanquishing and conquering and controlling and subjugating your enemy. That is, if a Muslim would have made this comment. But because it is Netanyahu, and because Netanyahu is obviously playing to the Israeli religious parties that are his allies, like Ben Gvir, Netanyahu himself, I don't believe for a second that he cares about the Old Testament or the Torah or whatever it says. Not for a second. But Netanyahu is talking to the Ben Gvirs of the world. Netanyahu is talking to the Israeli settlers of the world. Netanyahu is talking to the think tanks in Israel that do base and anchor their ideology on the theology, a particular reading of the Bible. It is very dangerous logic. You are saying God promised us not just this land, but promised us that the way we deal with those who in any way constitute trouble for us is through subjugation, not negotiation. And we keep this in mind. We keep the messaging, the Israeli messaging back and forth. Netanyahu begins this campaign with a reference to Isaiah. Religious parties know exactly what he's talking about. Religious think tanks know exactly what he's talking about. Right-wingers in the Israeli military know exactly what he's talking about. There is no quarter to be given to the enemy, no rights to be recognized in the other. You have a right to secure territory while giving zero rights to the other. The only option you accept from the other is bow at our feet. This logic, the dangers from this logic are endless. Because it is not just that Isaiah or what is attributed to Isaiah, because I don't believe that any of this was authentic to Isaiah. But keep in mind what was promised to Solomon. Right? Who is Solomon other than Nabiullah Sulaiman alayhi salatu wasalam? But in the Bible, Solomon is the one who built the second temple. The same temple that Israelis believe is under the site of the Aqsa Mosque. What led to this entire miserable tragedy is that Israeli religious settlers kept violating the sanctity of the Aqsa Mosque week after week after week. Everyone wants to ignore that. Everyone wants to forget that. Hamas kept saying time and time again, we will not tolerate. We are warning you. Stop violating the sanctity of the Aqsa Mosque. Unlike the Saudis and unlike the Emiratis, who do not give a hoot, not just about the sanctity of the Aqsa Mosque, but even the sanctity of Mecca and Medina. Because as we know, the Saudis turned Khadija's home into toilets. We know how much of the sacred sites in Mecca and Medina were destroyed by the Saudis. So, unlike the Saudi and Emirati model, there are plenty of Muslims, including Palestinians themselves, who care passionately and deeply about the Aqsa Mosque. So when Israel kept violating the sanctity of the Aqsa Mosque, this is part of the unfolding tragedy that led to this frenzy of violence. So Solomon, is the prophet that built the second temple. When Isaiah makes a reference to the Holy Land, Isaiah is making a reference to the Holy Land, not the Holy Land of Netanyahu, but the Holy Land of the prophet Solomon, the builder of the second temple. What is the problem with this? Well, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said to Abraham, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. So the danger in the logic that Netanyahu invoked is that the promise that God gave Solomon, the so-called promised land, is not the current Israel with its current borders, but as you've heard, the covenant that according to the Torah was given to Solomon is from the Nile to the Euphrates. Now, either Netanyahu means what he's saying or he doesn't. But what I am inviting you to do is to consider if a Muslim invoked these types of implications. If this was the Quran, not the Old Testament, imagine how many talking heads would be warning the world about the Muslim threat that believes that God gave them a covenant of between the Nile and the Euphrates, land that incidentally not just includes Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, but even parts of Turkey. Now, I don't know if Netanyahu believes in the Solomon covenant. And this is part of the entire problem with the fanatic religious right that wants to destroy the Aqsa Mosque, is because reclaiming the kingdom of Solomon is not just destroying the Aqsa Mosque to build the second temple, but it is an aggressive, imperialistic, colonial project that does not, it is not a theology of coexistence and tolerance. It is a theology of domination and subjugation. Bow at my feet. Again, I am not one of those people that says just because it's in the Bible, all religious Jews must believe it. There are many interpretive ways to avoid the type of implications, imperialistic and inhumane implications. But what I am saying is that for Netanyahu to invoke Isaiah's promise at the beginning of a slaughter, for Netanyahu to invoke Isaiah's promise, as we keep hearing Israeli agencies talk about transferring Palestinians to Egypt, for Netanyahu to invoke Isaiah's promise, as we keep hearing talking heads considering the nuke option and saying, yes, we've bombed them 2 atomic bombs worth, let's bomb them more. For Netanyahu to invoke the Isaiah promise as Ben Gvir distributes weapons to fanatic religious settlers, as Netanyahu invokes the Isaiah promise as these settlers distribute leaflets saying, leave, this is not your home, the second Nakba is coming. All of that, if the West had an iota of conscience or ethics or morality, the West would pause and say, even if we believe Hamas to be religious fanatics, you are no less fanatical. Your program, if you really mean what you're saying, is inhumane and dangerous and criminal. The West would not back up this government so unequivocally, so absolutely and totally. What is truly terrifying, though, what is truly terrifying is that there are indications that it is not the case that the West is oblivious to these plans, but that at least some parties in the West are completely on board with these plans. Dennis Ross published an article in the New York Times that I think is one of the most dangerous and scary documents of our modern history. Dennis Ross says in this article that I want to convince our Arab allies to moderate their reaction to what Israel is doing. But Dennis Ross says, to my great surprise, I was so happily surprised when, as I went from one capital in the Arab world to another, from Egypt, the implication of the article is even the Palestinian Authority, although he doesn't say so expressly. But as I flew from Egypt to Saudi Arabia to the Emirates to Jordan, that I found that while all these governments publicly were saying we condemn the violence, they were actually egging and cheering Israel along to destroy Hamas and to end the Palestinian resistance and for all. And if the way to end this resistance is to transfer the population of Gaza, so be it. Dennis Ross, who's a famous Zionist, an American diplomat, one of the more Zionists than Kissinger, says, I was so happy. Similarly, Kushner, in an interview, said something very similar. The Emiratis and Saudis, the Emiratis are actually formally and publicly against the Palestinians. They came out in Israel's support openly. But Kushner says, I found my Saudi friends not only not concerned with Israel's attack on Gaza, but fully supportive and eager to continue the peace talks, in quotes, and normalization of relations after Israel destroys the resistance of Gaza. Do you really think if you destroy Hamas, the resistance will end in Gaza? And that is why the transfer option, because Israel knows fully well that misery begets resistance, and that the life of Palestinians in Gaza is absolutely miserable. And so Hamas or no Hamas, they will resist. And that is why, again, we go to that option of you will bow before me. You will not oppose or resist me. If we are going to read Isaiah normatively as a promise, as Netanyahu did in the beginning of his campaign, and as I keep hearing on Israeli TV all the time, but just so we are very clear, what we are talking about when we are talking about whether we're talking about dropping bombs, the equivalent of 2 Hiroshima atomic bombs, or we are talking about a nuke option, or we are talking about transferring the population, we are talking about genocide. The term genocide itself is from Latin, 2 Latin words. Geno means type, race, tribe, and side, killing. And according to the lawyer that actually invented this term, and the reason that the lawyer that invented this term did so is because we were searching for a word to describe the destruction of entire populations and cultures in World War II. So the very idea of the Genocide Convention can't. It is a crime of genocide, a crime against humanity, an absolute war crime, a non-crime. In other words, there are no exceptions to the prohibition. If you transfer a population, if you kill in mass, if you effectively prevent a population from freely breeding and existing and living, that is the crime of genocide. So the terrifying possibility that Kushner and Dennis Ross are informing us about is that not just the religious right that is in favor of a genocide against the Palestinian people, but so are the Arab leaders sitting in Saudi Arabia, sitting in the Emirat. If these two are to be believed, also the King of Jordan and even the Prime Minister of Tunisia. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم وأسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه يا رب العالمين. You see, this is all very critical because remember, the logic of terror, the logic of oppression, the logic of subjugation is infectious and evil, as infectious as evil itself. Recently, some of the most prominent law firms in the United States came together and, taking their cue from the Biden administration, decided to make a stand against anti-Semitism on US campuses. And so these prominent law firms, the Constitution, forgetting human rights conventions, forgetting the guarantees of liberty and freedom of speech. For years, we were lectured again and again about how Muslims cannot understand the commitments of freedom of speech. But now these law firms come together and say, if you oppose the genocide that is taking place in Gaza, if you demonstrate against this genocide, we will blacklist you. So we are going to punish you for exercising your right to freedom of speech. The fact that this is coming from our lawyers and our president, the fact that this is from the people that have smugly and arrogantly, time and time and time again, told the entire world, we are civilized because we believe in freedom of speech and freedom of opinion. But they come to the issue of genocide, and there is no freedom of speech and there is no freedom of opinion. Shut up or you will be blacklisted and you won't find a legal job in the United States. Now, does this remind you of anything? Yes, it reminds me of Isaiah's promise to Israel's enemies. you will bow before my gate. The logic of evil is infectious. Netanyahu tells the Palestinians, you shall bow. And the American law firms tell the supporters of Palestine, you shall bow before us. Don't you dare open your mouth. Don't you dare think freely. Weigh your morality and ethical obligations freely. Bow before us for doing what we want and telling us what we want to hear. Isaiah's promise. The logic of evil is infectious. Now, but notice that what allows for the evil of the genocide against the Palestinian people is repression, subjugation, and despotism. For darkness, for evil to do what it wants without accountability, without oversight, without the light of truth shining upon it. The very premise of the logic of genocide is the logic of subjugation. The Isaiah promise, you will bow, but in order for you to bow, I cannot be held accountable. You cannot investigate my crimes. I will not allow you to have the power to say, don't kill children, don't kill women, don't bomb hospitals, don't bomb ambulances. That same logic, that same evil, subjugation, repression, oppression, is what we see from the law firms in the United States that come together and say to poor law students, shut up and do what you're told. The same logic of intimidation and subjugation and harassment from the Canary Project that tells professors, don't you dare think for yourself. Don't you dare object, protest. Don't you dare analyze, or you will lose your job and not be hireable. But see the irony and see how Allah teaches us. It is also at the root cause of the evil of the Arab rulers. Why are the Arab rulers capable of this duplicity, capable of this hypocrisy? Why do they fear the Palestinian resistance? Because the Palestinian resistance to occupation and oppression relies not on entitlement, but on the masses. Without mass support, the Palestinian resistance would vanish in an instant. And mass support is what these Arab leaders do not have and will never have. In order to stay in power, they use the same logic of bow before my door. In order to stay in power, Sisi of Egypt relies on repression, relies on terrorism, relies on fear. So does the king of Saudi Arabia, and so does the king of the Emirat, and so does the king of Jordan, and so does the Prime Minister of Tunisia. What do you call this? If you fail to see the consistent theme of intoxicating frenzy of dictators and despots and oppressors who do not want the air of freedom of liberty anywhere, how can you fail to see this? The darkness of the mind, the dullness of the conscience, the reaction, hostile reaction to the voice of freedom or free thinking. One final point, but it is a critical point. The ailment of the Muslim world everywhere is the disease of despotism. No one should be heard to talk about what this ruler was able to build for his country or not build for his country. It is entirely beside the issue. The real issue is that we Muslims stand in a moment in which we have no say, absolutely no say, in what happens to the Aqsa Mosque. And for that matter, what happens to Mecca or what happens in Medina. We Muslims are entirely powerless to even protect the home of Khadija, leave alone all the other Islamic sites that were destroyed and erased from the face of the earth by Saudis or Israelis. We Muslims witness the usurpation of the Khalil Mosque, and we are entirely powerless to do anything. We Muslims have no say as to how a country with the history and resources of Egypt is ruled or not ruled. In fact, we sit there and witness powerlessly as Egypt helps Israel suffocate Gaza and subjugate Gaza and close all passages for breathing for Gaza. We Muslims have no say if the Egyptian military decides to accept the bribes and to allow the transfer of Gaza to Egyptian land. We have no say. We Muslims have no say when Saudi Arabia decides in the midst of the slaughter to have parties and concerts and to live it up. We Muslims have no say when we read reports that the United Arab Emirates is not just supporting Israel through speech, but is actually sending regularly aircraft packed with hardware, military aid to Israel. And according to Israeli sources, even that the Emirati pilots took part in the bombings of Gaza. Curiously, the United Emirates didn't even comment, didn't either confirm nor deny, although this story has been all over Israeli media, where Israeli pilots said, yes, we were very happy because we flew side by side with Emirati pilots and bombed Gaza together. And we'd expected that the Emirat would say something, but complete silence. What is our ailment? Oppression and despotism. We do not control our fate. We are far from self-determination and you can possibly get. So what happens when people cannot determine their fate on big issues, on matters that matter? People turn stupid. People become dumb. They start becoming pedantic and like mini robots, incapable of true thought or true analysis. A young guy contacts me, a Palestinian, and says, I wanted to have a visual for the victims of Gaza, but the MSA told me we can't have a visual honoring the victims of Gaza, not because they're opposed to honoring the victims of Gaza, but because having a visual is a bid'ah. And there is disagreement of opinions among scholars whether a visual is allowable or not allowable. This is exactly the type of stupidity that despotism leaves behind in the minds of the subjugated and oppressed. People are dying in mass. Entire families are being obliterated off the face of the earth. And your is whether a visual is a bid'ah. How more pedantic and dumb can you be? This is the how you manufacture dull minds. The very nature of despotism and subjugation, the very nature of the Isaiah option to the subjugated, you will bow before me, is it that it creates the infection of dumbness and stupidity, narrowness, the incapacity to reason even in a straightforward, even about the most rational matters. If visual is a bid'ah, that's the issue. Wow. اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم اعف عنا اللهم ارحمنا يا رب العالمين وتب علينا يا تواب اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا رب العالمين اللهم انصر أهل غزة انصر المقاومين اللهم ارحم أهل غزة اللهم الطف بأهل غزة اللهم يا رب قدرنا على أن نعين أهل غزة وصلي وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى على النبي الأمين وأقم الصلاة.